Welcome to Jira Asset Basics. I'm going to show you exactly how to set up and use schema within your assets and some basics on getting started. Let's jump in. All right, so what are assets and why should you care? So I like to think of assets as an open database or maybe something a little bit less technical, like an Excel spreadsheet on steroids. We could store all of our assets and data inside of this database and then create relationships between those assets. But where the real magic happens is linking those assets to Jira directly. So let's use an IT team as an example. IT teams typically receive requests, either an incident or a service request from end users. Now, when a request is submitted, we can automatically look up who submitted this request and what hardware they're using inside of our asset schema and link that directly to the ticket as soon as it's created. So as soon as a ticket is created, the tech can jump in and see exactly which laptop is being used. Now, this applies to a lot of other things as well. For example, software, other hardware like peripherals, permissions and policies, and a whole lot more. So an IT team is just a really basic example that I like to bring up, but there's definitely a lot more use cases for assets and relating them to Jira, which we'll cover in this course. All right, so let's jump in and create our first asset. So in order to find your assets, if you have the new UI, you'll have the assets button on the very left side here. If you're on the old UI, which you're probably not by the time you're watching this, it might be at the top, there might be a top bar, and it might be under a more panel, but it's either going to be at the top somewhere or on the left side as you see here. So I'll click on that, and this will take me to the home page of my assets. So if I ever want to go home, or if I'm lost in some kind of an object or object schema, all I have to do is click this button on the top right, and I'm brought to the very home page with all of my object schemas. So to create our first asset, I'll jump into a schema, and we have what are object types and objects. I'll click on the blue create button at the top, and we'll be creating our first asset, which in this case is an office. So this is going to be a location of an office, so I'll type in something along the lines of Seattle. I don't know if I have one of these already, but I'll create Seattle, and then we can enter an address, date incorporated, employees, if we'd like, and then we could click create. All those are optional except for the name, so I'm just going to fill out the name for this example. I'll create this, and it looks like we already did have a Seattle, so we did create a duplicate, but that is how we create our very first object inside our asset schema. All right, so what is an object schema? So an object schema is essentially a collection of different object types and objects. We'll go over exactly what those are later in the course, but for now, all you need to know is that objects flow into object types, which then flow into your your asset schemas. So your asset schemas are kind of like folders or different groups for all of your object types and categorization for everything that you're storing. So if you look at the asset schema that we have here, we have different groups, things like facilities, IT employee assets, people, a whole bunch other. But if I jump into one of these like facilities, all of these are going to be related to locations. So we won't be adding things like users here or IT hardware because we're only focusing on facilities. So as I said, it's pretty much a group or a way to store or kind of like a folder of all of your assets that you can bundle into one place. So how do we actually create one of these? So on the top right here, we have a create schema button. We could click on that. And then we have a couple of templates here, which I recommend using these templates if you're just starting out. Create one of these templates, jump around, use some of these asset schemas to get familiar with it. But if you're starting with something that you're already familiar with, or you're building out a very specific schema, or your template's not here, we're gonna go ahead and create a blank one. So when you click that, you'll enter in a schema name. So I'll name this test 2 just for the demo. We'll give it a key. I think that one's already taken, so I'll do test 2. And then we could add a description, which is optional, so I'll leave that blank for now. And then we create our schema. So now we have a brand new schema. If I go back to our home page, we have the test 2 and the test schema. I think it was this one that I created, and it's completely blank, and we'll start to jump in and create all of our objects and object types later inside of this course. Real quick, I've implemented Jira for over 200 companies. By far, the #1 reason teams reach out to us is because they built what they thought was a great solution only to realize that nobody actually ended up using it. And if that sounds familiar, that's exactly what we help you fix. We're currently taking on new projects 4 to 6 weeks out. And if you want help implementing Jira in a way that your team will actually use, hit the first link in the description below. All right, so before we jump into creating our objects and object types, let's go over some of the schemas that we can create and some of the most common things that I've seen clients do and use assets for. So a lot of those things are listed here, things like application portfolios where you could store all of your software, link those to individual permissions and users. That's a very common use case. Customer support, this is kind of an expansion or something a little bit more robust than the customer and organization tracking out of Jira Service Management. A lot of customers or clients that I've worked with use this when the native features for the customers and organizations are somewhat lacking for their needs. Engineering support, this is a group of teams and users, so this is very common to be able to link different groups or teams to individual Jira tickets. Then we have things like facilities, which we already covered a little bit of, but that's just going to be your locations. You have IT employee assets, and I mentioned this one a lot, but it's things like IT hardware, your laptops, phones, monitors, and a whole lot of other things that you could track from your IT team. We have people, so you could also sync this with Azure AD as well as Intune for your IT assets, but you could sync all of your Google Workspace individuals, your Azure individuals into the asset schema. That way you can automatically have them imported here and synced anytime you create users there. That does tend to be very common. Sometimes they're managed in here alone without any integration, but I've seen for the most part our clients using a sync between some kind of third-party platform. Practice standards, so anything related to policies and permissions can be stored here and then related to those users. I'll skip over services for now, but a lot of other things that I've seen have been even physical asset tracking, like shipping different assets from jobs to sites to a lot of other things. Now services, this one, it does dive into a lot more on-prem and service-related infrastructure that you might have within your organization. Could be cloud as well, but the idea here is that you could store all of your services that you're hosting and that you're providing for your clients. And then you have all of your infrastructure inside of your asset schema. And then all of that supports a service, like a business service or an application. And then as soon as a server goes down or a cloud infrastructure goes down, you see exactly which service that affects. So you could use this with change management if you need to upgrade or change servers. If you have outages, you know exactly which servers are going to affect which applications and a whole lot more. So this does go super in depth, and I've worked on a few of these implementations for a few different clients in the past. And it does go very in depth, but if you have some kind of services or applications, this is a great way to be able to store them and be able to submit change requests through Jira or incidents through Jira and see which services are affected. So the last thing to note about object schemas is that each one has its own settings. To find those settings, you could open up your schemas and then click on the three dots on the right side and click on settings. This will bring you to a screen that looks like this. And let's just really quickly dive into what exactly these settings are and what changes you can make. So there's some general info about this schema at the very top here. You can't change most of this other than name and description. The rest of these are just pulling information from what's currently in your schema. There's a few additional settings down here. I would tend not to change any of these unless you're limiting directly the types of relationships your objects want to create. I've never had a need to change any of these. So again, unless you're trying to limit if objects can create relationships with the schema, I would leave these all checked. You could also delete your schema down here. Definitely don't do that unless you're 100% sure you want to remove and lose all of your data associated with the schema and never get it back. The second tab is reference types. So reference types allow you to create the relationships between objects. And what's really great about the way that Jira does this is that it actually allows you to create custom reference types. So there's a few out of box that you can see here. We have different colors to associate those reference types, and we'll go over those in depth later. But we could create a new reference type for this schema, name it whatever we'd like, give it a description, a color, and then we could use that reference type when relating new objects. The last thing that I'll cover in this video, we'll be covering roles and permissions in a later video in this course, same thing with importing. But the last thing is going to be your statuses. So out of box, you'll have a certain number or a certain set of statuses that Jira gives you, like active, running, decommissioned. I don't remember exactly what that list was, but if you wanted to add custom statuses that you could use with an attribute or field within your object types, you can do that here. So that's a quick overview of the settings that we have for these schemas. We'll dive into the objects next. There are two places that we could set roles and permissions within our assets. The first is going to be on a schema level, and the second is going to be on an object type level. To get to our object type permissions, we go into a schema, we go to our object type list, click the three dots, go to object type settings, and in here there's going to be a tab for roles. I'm going to skip over this because we have all the same options in our schema, and it's going to be a little bit redundant to go over all of them. Back to our schema list, we'll go ahead and open up our facility schema as we were looking at earlier, and we'll go into these settings. In here, we're going to have our roles tab. And we have a few different roles that are essentially created by Atlassian for us to assign either to a group, to a user, or to an app. So apps are typically going to request these when you install them, so no need to look at those unless they're specifically requesting them. But for the rest of these, you can click on this button here, and that will take you to a page that looks like this. So we have a couple of different options. Object Viewer, which is exactly what it sounds. It lets you pretty much just read and view different objects within that space. Users, developers, managers, and Jira admins. Jira admins aren't included in that list because those are org admins or site admins, which by default have permissions to view all of your entire asset schema. So you have your users, developers, and managers, and you could go through this list to see what each of those does. I won't go into each and every one of these options, but you could go through and find out which particular role you need to assign to a particular individual or group. Once you figured that out, all you have to do is go into your roles and start assigning users or groups, and you'll have some out of box that are already assigned to most of the schemas that you have. But if you wanted to start tweaking these manually and adding things like users, developers, managers, and viewers, you could go through and add them here. The only thing that I'm going to mention here for kind of setting this up in the best way is to definitely use groups as much as you can. So if you have a group of users or a particular permission set, or maybe for particular departments, and you're grouping those users in there, definitely use groups rather than users. Use users only when you have to, or if those particular users aren't a part of a group. Otherwise, you'll end up having to control and micromanage each of the permissions of each user, which gets very, very tiring for your Jira admin, or for you if you're the Jira admin. So definitely use groups when you can, and sync those from AD if you can as well, or Google Workspace. That way they're managed outside of Jira, and you just bring them in and assign the roles here.